Welcome to In Our Town, Conversations with Springfieldians Making a Difference. I'm your host, Tom Carlson, publisher of the Springfield Daily Citizen. If you'd like to comment on this episode, our email is inourtown@sgfcitizen.org. We'd love to hear from you. In the last 15 years, teenage mental illness has been on the rise throughout the country. Since 2010, the amount of major depression for girls is up 145%, and for boys, it's 161%. For those of us who are mathematically challenged, that means that for every 100 boys that had these kinds of conditions in 2010, now there are 261. Also, there's been a rise in disorders relating to anxiety. Recently, this issue has taken center stage right here in Springfield with the publication of a book by a New York University psychologist, Jonathan Haidt. The name of the book is called The Anxious Generation: How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. The book has spurred debate at the Springfield School Board. The issue that the board is wrestling with is this: should there be a school-wide policy on how to regulate cell phone use, or should it be left up to the various principals at each of the schools? That's the current policy, but the discussion seems to be moving in another direction. With me today to talk about the pros and cons of this issue, how to regulate cell phone use in the schools, is Amy Hill. She's a local mental health expert. She knows what's going on in the schools, and she is the Executive Vice President of Community and School-Based Services for Brightly, which is the umbrella organization for Borough Mental Health. Amy, welcome to In Our Town.
Thank you, Tom. I'm happy to be here.
Well, tell us, what is your job? So I've introduced you as an expert. Don't disappoint me here.
Okay. Well, I'll do my best. I am, just like you said, I'm an executive vice president at Brightly. So I have the opportunity to work with all of our regions. We're in a multi-state organization at this point, really focusing as a subject matter expert in school-based programming. So we have a very large school-based mental health program at Brightly. So I get the opportunity to work with all of our school-based teams across our system, as well as some of our youth and adult community teams. My area of expertise really is in youth mental health. I've spent the majority of my last 20 years plus of my career working with kids, most of that time working in the school system with kids and adults and administrators. And so I really just kind of get to do that every day.
Well, you heard what I had to say about the rise in mental illness among teens. Would you generally agree with that?
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I generally would. I think over the last few years, youth mental illness, youth mental health is getting a lot of attention, rightfully so. There's a lot of people that are concerned about it. We've heard the words youth mental health crisis, not just in our state, but really in our nation. And I think it's rightfully so. I think it's something we need to be talking about and addressing.
I'm a little bit of a newcomer to this whole issue. I guess I had some level of awareness about it, but in particular, Cliff Smart, who is the president at Missouri State, and still is for another week or so.
Sure.
When the new candidates were being interviewed at public forums, all of them talked about the rise of mental illness and the issues that they're having to deal with at the college level. And I was surprised.
Sure. I would say 10 years ago, if you were to ask a superintendent in our state or states around us, what are your top 5 concerns? I don't know that student behavioral mental health would have been listed on there, maybe not even on their radar at all. And now I think there's a pretty strong consensus. If you were to look at some of the data, even survey some local superintendents here, hey, where does mental health fall on your list of concerns for your district? And it might be top 3 for some. And I would say definitely within the top 5 for most superintendents, identifying that as a big concern.
So I hear in terms of depression, increased attempted suicides, anxiety. Let's just take the first one, depression. What are the kids depressed about?
So the interesting thing about depression is that people say, I have nothing to be depressed about. What am I depressed about? And that's kind of the thing about depression. You don't necessarily have to have something to be depressed about. It's just really kids are feeling sad, reporting feeling sad more days than not. I think there's a lot of reasons why that is what we can attribute that to. We look at youth. Let's take elementary age kids, for example. What we know through research and just exploring kids is that they look to adults to find their self-esteem, their confidence, their acceptance. They are really looking at their teachers and their parents to just provide that for them. And we live in a day and age where kids, their home life is all over the place. Even with how much sleep should a second grader be getting? You might have a parent who that's very important to them and another one who could care less about how much sleep their kids get. So oftentimes those feelings can be attributed to things that are happening at home. We know the prevalence of traumatic events happening to kids continues to increase. It's very prevalent. So a lot of younger kids, they might be depressed or sad or really anxious about things that might be happening at home or even some things at school. There's a shift in that dynamic when kids become adolescents, and they start to really find their self-esteem, their self-confidence, their levels of success. They look to their peers for that. And so a lot of kids really struggle with those peer relationships, those interpersonal skills at school. And we certainly know I know we're going to talk much more about this. You mentioned it earlier, but we know the role that cell phones and social media usage and all of those things can place in that as well.
How would you distinguish between depression and anxiety?
So depression is more just a feeling of sadness, unhappy, maybe just more days than not. You don't feel happy, a loss of motivation, not really anything to look forward to, and just an overall feeling of down. Anxiety is much more of a feeling of just anxiousness, irritability, restlessness, worry, concern, all of those things. I just recently saw Inside Out 2 with my two younger kids. The Inside Out movies also, I think, do a really great job of helping people who maybe don't work in mental health understand the difference of those feelings. It's interesting about depression and anxiety and even how you treat them. We do treat them differently. With depression, just the loss of motivation, finding things for people to be interested in certainly can have a physiological effect there. But we see things like anxiety and stress really can have a physical toll. They can take a physical toll on the health of both adults and youth. And so the signs and symptoms could be similar, especially in kids. It's really hard. Sometimes you feel like you're throwing spaghetti at a wall to figure out what's going on with a kid, seeing what sticks. But sometimes with depression and anxiety, that can look like irritability in kids. Both of those things can. And so sometimes it does feel like, gosh, this is complicated to figure out what's going on here. But yeah, those are all signs that we look at.
As a layperson, it's easy for me because I am not knowledgeable to have firm opinions.
Sure.
So push back if you feel it's appropriate on this feeling that I have.
Okay.
I think depression and anxiety, one source of that could be because somebody's not socially adept dealing with other people or situations. And so you can become very anxious. What am I supposed to do in this particular circumstance? And I've, in preparing for the interview today, I ran across an idea that maybe to some extent what we call helicopter parents are a problem. When I was growing up back in the Stone Age, we were just kicked out of the house, told to go work it out at the playground and that sort of thing. We could travel a mile on our bicycles, and for whatever reason, now a lot of parents are very anxious about safety, and they need to protect kids from this or that. And the idea being that as a consequence, kids aren't learning the social skills to work about things. They don't take risks. They're anxious about a lot of things that in past times they could work through. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a really good thought. I think we tend to live in extreme parallels oftentimes. We have the pendulum swings on both sides.
Right.
And so I think we could definitely talk about helicopter parenting, and even in regards to being connected to their kids through a cell phone throughout the course of the day. Those kids are constantly communicating with their parents about what their teacher said or what happened or what they're experiencing. On the other end of that extreme, we have an issue of absentee parents, parents
Yes.
who aren't involved at all. And so they're not also teaching their kids those same sort of social skills and things that are needed. And so, too much of anything is a bad thing, right? So too much of absenteeism also contributes to that lack of just getting that instruction, being exposed in some of those social circumstances and environments. There might be a kid who has never been to a zoo before and doesn't know how that you can't just run away all over the zoo, or they've never been to a library, so they don't know that you have to talk in an inside voice
Yes.
because they've never had those experiences before. Our brains are absolutely shaped by our experience. We know that through neuroscience. And so again, the helicopter parent, that's a different experience too. If you never allow your child the opportunity to problem solve or just allow them the opportunity to sit in the uncomfortable feeling, and you're constantly rescuing that, that isn't helpful either. So I think you're onto something. And I think we experience it across the board in both extremes.
Well, there's a lot of plasticity with the human brain.
There sure is, yeah.
And I know certainly in my case, it wasn't completely developed till my mid-20s.
Sure.
And as the question may be an open question still in some venues, but be that as it may, our experiences have to affect that, don't they?
100%, 100%.
And so we have, as society changes, the way our kids were developing for the last thousands of years have changed a heck of a lot in the last few decades.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Is that a good thing?
That's always the question, right? Like, is it a good thing? Is technology really helping us or hindering us? You kind of referenced riding on bikes and the things that you did. I've talked a lot about this to people when I've given the opportunity. I grew up in a home that we didn't even have a deadbolt on our door. It was just a little turn.
We didn't either.
Yeah,
we had a dog that would bark.
Exactly. We weren't just consuming information in the way that we are now. And so you talked about the parents constantly worried about their safety. I'm a mom of 4 kids. I've got 2 teenage drivers. I can monitor on Life 360 how fast they're driving. Did they brake hard? Did they use their phone? All of those things. That didn't exist when I was a 16-year-old. My mom and dad would say, be home in 8 hours. Hope you're well. We'll hear from you if you're not. There was no cell phone. There's no way tracking that. So the consumption of information that we get through the media, through social media, through the internet. One of the statistics that you were talking about in the intro, as you mentioned, from 2010
Yes.
to 2024. What happened in 2010? Well, that was the invention of the smartphone.
Yes.
That's when the invention of the smartphone occurred. And so when we look at just the way our brains are consuming information, the way we're experiencing the world right now, it's incredibly different. And you mentioned neuroplasticity and neuroscience. Our brains are shaped by our experiences. The good news is there's always hope. From our first breath to our last breath, our brains are constantly changing. And although maybe they reach full development at 25, like you mentioned, your brain is still undergoing changes, and so is mine right now. And so there's still opportunity for hope and change, but it's definitely a different experience than what we've had 20, 30, 40 years ago.
I'm reminded, I'm quite a bit older than you are, but it was back in the 70s, I think, a big movie came out called Jaws.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And of course, after that, my wife and I went to the beach.
Sure.
We were both very anxious about getting out in the water, even though there's not been a reported
Right.
shark there forever. We didn't really want to get out further than knee deep. And it was just that visual thing.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember looking it up, how many shark attacks in the whole world, whatever the number was, 20 or something.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
But it affected all of us just because of that visualization. And I have to think there's some correlation between all that and people looking at images on a cell phone or iPad, and the way news content is monetized
Right.
in order to grab eyeballs to make, the
Right.
old saying, and I'm an ex-journalist, the old saying is, if it bleeds, it leads.
Right.
And
Right.
that can't be good.
No, it's impacting the development of our kids' brains. Something I feel very strongly about that I don't think we're very good at all in our in our world is I feel strongly that you need to have adult conversations with adults and kid conversations with kids. And unfortunately, we have a lot of adult conversations in the presence of children, and we don't recognize what that does to their developing brain and how those thoughts get stuck in their mind. Like you mentioned Jaws, and then you thought about that, you had the visual. And we hear things and we see things that really our brains are not developed enough to be able to process in a mature way. It sticks with us. Sticks with them. It sticks with the way that their brains are wired and just the paths and the ways that they think and behave. And we oftentimes don't recognize how that can create anxiety. We're talking about an anxious generation, right? And so understanding the conversations that we have in front of children and the things that we allow our kids to see and observe and experience can have a significant impact on the way their brains are developed.
So there was an HG movie called Book, and they made a movie later called The Time Machine.
Yeah.
And you could go, as I recall, in the past or forward. Can you imagine, let's say, back up 100 years, it's 1924, and somebody gets in the time machine, they come to the car, and they say, look, when these people go out to eat, they don't talk to each other. They all look at their cell phones.
Sure.
What's up with that, you know?
Yeah.
It's just not the kids. It's all of us. And one of my pet gripes is being out with some people for like a dinner occasion, and somebody keeps checking his or her phone.
Right.
There's no etiquette to the whole darn thing.
Right. Yeah.
And how are kids going to learn if parents aren't good models?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's an addiction, right? You'll hear people talk about that. It's an addiction. Yeah.
My wife and I are addicted to cat videos on Instagram.
Yeah.
I mean, you know.
Yeah, it happens.
My name's Tom Carlson, and I'm an Instagram addict.
Yeah, I mean, and you're not alone in that. You know, a lot of people are. And when I mentioned being a mom of four, you know, having these two teenagers, and gosh, this school year I have a junior in high school, and I said, you need to be doing your homework. She was laying on the couch with her phone in front of her face. You need to be doing your homework. Get off your phone. She says, I am doing my homework. And believe it or not, that kid was writing a paper with her thumbs on her phone.
No kidding.
And that's just how she does homework. And so again, when we're talking about the way that our kids are learning and how beneficial is a cell phone, and really just recognizing that this is their future. This is the world in which they're growing up in. They are growing up in a world in which technology and personal devices, that is the way of the future. You know, I think about my parents, they're in their 70s, you know, they're part of the boomer generation, and how often they have to call me and ask me, hey, what's going on here? I don't know how to work this thing on Facebook, or how do I connect my TV to Netflix, and all of these questions that I can answer now. But I have the same kind of questions for my kids. Like, I'm not exactly sure how to use this filter on Instagram, or how do I save this story, or whatever it might be. My kids know that. And so accepting the reality of, okay, this is really weird to me that my 16-year-old, my 17-year-old's writing a paper on her phone, yet she's doing it and she's getting an A. And so how can I...
she's probably using ChatGPT.
She might be too. You know, she might be using that too. But again, just really trying to wrap my brain around, as a mom and a mental health professional who works with kids, what technology looks like today and how it's important, and then helping that guide some of my opinions or thoughts or suggestions for parents and even educators on what is important for kids.
We'll be right back after this short break.
Hi, I'm Rance Berger. I'm the managing editor of the Springfield Daily Citizen. I've been a Missouri journalist for about 18 years now. I've worked a total of 8 different jobs in 5 different places, but it's all been in Missouri. The hardest part of my job is really finding time to give all of our stories the love that they deserve. We have such a great group of reporters. When they work that hard, I want to be able to put that much work back into their stories to make them even better. The most rewarding part of my job is just being as plugged into what life is here in Springfield, Missouri. I get to know everything that's going on in government, in business, in education. I like living in Springfield because it's never boring, there's always something to do, and there's a wide variety of experiences available. You just have to be willing to put yourself out there a little bit and go look for them.
What are your thoughts about cell phone usage in the classroom?
Yeah, that's a big debate right now, isn't it?
Yes.
Not just in our area, certainly in our area, but really across the country. A quick Google search would show you school districts that have had a ban in this or set some guidelines and some policies. I have given this a lot of thought, listened to the narratives on it, looked at some of the research behind it. And what we do know is, again, I'm going to kind of go back to what I said a minute ago, too much of anything is a bad thing. But also, we are raising a generation of youth who do have to understand technology in order to be successful. It is a part of their life and it's what they need. So I do think that there's a way that these things can be married. I've seen both sides of the argument. I think technology is important to
Your
learning.
name was Solomon in the Bible, and you wanted to cut the baby in half, didn't you?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. It's really hard when you can see the evidence on both sides of the argument to be able to say this is that there's a hard, fast line in what needs to happen here.
Okay, so I referenced this book, The Anxious Generation, and one of his recommendations is essentially no cell phone use for kids under 16. They can have a flip phone. React to that.
Let me think about that for a second. So here would be, my argument for that would be, I get it. I understand why. It's a distraction. It hasn't done our children any favors to be on social media, to have constant contact with people. But almost every public school system in the nation has moved away from textbooks and papers and number 2 pencils. You're just not filling out a bubble
Is that a good
test
thing?
form anymore. I think so. And
On balance, you're for that.
Yeah, the reason why I think it's a good thing is because when is the last time you have had to communicate with, how did you and I communicate to even set this up? Through email and through cell phone,
correct.
right? Yeah.
Yep.
And so we're not having to write letters to each other, send it in the mail and send something up. And so our kids are growing up in a world in which they have to understand technology in order to not be obsolete. They're going to have to be able to function that way. So if we say we're going back to textbooks and paper and number 2 pencils and filling out bubble screens, that isn't going to teach them the skills that they're going to need to be successful as adults.
Okay, well, I got to push back on that one a little bit too, all right?
Sure.
I was reading something somewhere, and again, I'm a lay person. What the author was saying is when you are writing physically on a tablet, you're having to focus your eyes and your muscles, and it's all reinforcing what you're trying to do, as opposed to this sort of fragmented approach.
Yeah.
To respond to that.
Yeah, I think there's some research that says when you write things down, it helps you with your memory. There's even some research that talks about if you learn how to write in cursive, how
Yes.
that engages both hemispheres in different places of your brain. So there's a lot of research to support all of that. And so I'm not suggesting we move away from teaching kids how to write on paper or teaching cursive. It's not my area of
Okay.
expertise. I'm not suggesting that.
Well, I didn't want to let you get away with anything.
Yeah. Well, I'm not suggesting that.
All
I
right.
do think to move, I guess my argument would be, why a flip phone? Why would they need a flip phone? Why even have a phone in the first place if it isn't going to help them connect to technology in the classroom?
So, because mom's not going to be able to pick them up at 3:30.
Okay, sure. Yeah, sure. And so there is that component of safety. I think the argument to that is a couple of things. Number one, a lot of these kids, they have to use their phone. My 17-year-old, trust me, she does not have to type her paper on her cell phone.
Right.
But there are a lot of kids that do. They might not have access to internet at home. They might not have access to a computer, but mom and dad have a smartphone. Almost everyone in the world has a smartphone now.
So you're saying you're okay then with kids using cell phone during classroom time?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that I think it'd be really hard to eliminate it altogether.
All right.
I think it'd be really hard to eliminate it altogether. And I think that there needs to be some boundaries set around that. I think that what we do know, if kids are looking at Instagram, they're not learning. If they're texting, having a full text conversation with a friend, they're not learning. If they're calling their mom because they forgot their Chromebook for the 17th day in a row and mom is bringing it for the 17th day in a row, they're not learning to try to become responsible with their Chromebook. So I think that there definitely needs to be some boundaries set around it. I think what becomes very difficult is to draw a hard, fast line. We're doing 0 of this or 100%. I think that that's when things get really difficult.
So one of the things I've read about with cell phone use among teens is there's a lot of bullying.
There is. Yeah, there is a lot of bullying.
So on the one hand, you're saying Look, this isn't the days of Abraham Lincoln. We live in the 21st century. We have to adapt to technology. But so if you're going to let the kid use the cell phone to type out her term paper, how do you know she's doing that and not bullying her friends?
Yeah.
And who in the world can police that?
Exactly. We don't. We can't know and we can't police it. And to be honest, it's part of the issue with having cell phone bans in schools is how are you going to enforce that? Like, how do we police these things and enforce them? I think that's where it's...
Why isn't it easy just say, put your phone at the door when you come in?
Yeah. And
that doesn't seem particularly complicated to me.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of districts and a lot of teachers have moved towards that, just having some real regulated time. Like when you walk in, you've probably seen some teachers have those pouches that could be used to store your shoes at and home. You know, everyone puts their cell phone in their pouch when they walk in, and you only go get it whenever maybe you need it for a project that you're working on in class, or it's free time, or when you're leaving when the bell rings, and then you've got your 5-minute passing period to look at your phone until the next classroom, and then you do it again. There's a lot of districts that are pursuing those sorts of things as well. And so I think you're right. I think you're a good question. Why not consider that? I think it is something that teachers should consider.
So, as I said in my intro, there's some debate now with the local school board about what the policy should be.
Yeah.
Right now, the enforcement, to what extent and so forth, is left up to the individual principals at each of the school. What's the argument pro and con for, on the one hand, finding out what best practices are and having a uniform policy versus letting the principal at Parkview do what he or she thinks best?
Yeah, and you know, I couldn't tell you all of the best practice. I haven't researched all of the information or reviewed the literature on exactly what all the best practices are. I do think it's probably a little early for some of that too. I think there's probably a lot of studies that are happening right now that's going to give us some more concrete information on some of those things. Again, when we're talking about an enforcement issue, and when we look at, you know, one of the things you and I haven't discussed yet, but something that certainly is pretty important to me, when you look at suspensions, both in school and out of school suspensions across our state and the nation, the overwhelming majority of them are for what's called minor infractions. And so that's oftentimes, and those top 3 minor infractions are cell phone usage, like as disruption to the policy for cell phone usage, dress code violations, and then usually using foul language. And so what we know beyond a shadow of a doubt that is the most important thing for children is that they need to be in school. Kids need to be in school for all kinds of reasons I could talk about for the next hour, but I won't. But we know through literature, kids need to be in school. So we're suspending children for really minor infractions. Again, not talking about major infractions. There's a time and a place for those too. But when the majority of suspensions are for minor infractions, it's keeping kids out of the one place that we absolutely know that they need to be. And so when we're going to set policies that are going to be really difficult to enforce and that then might result in children being out of school, you're just not going to convince me that that's best for kids. I wouldn't be able to get behind that argument because I've seen all the literature about what is best for kids, which is being in school. Now, again, when kids are in school, we want them to learn. We need them to have access to their prefrontal lobe and be able to concentrate and focus on school and not worry about all the other nonsense, or athletes always refer to it as the noise, right? Like, let the noise go to where you can focus and learn. We know that's important too. And we also know that kids aren't great decision makers. Again, their brain isn't fully developed. And so they're dependent upon the adults around them to be a surrogate brain for them and to help them make better decisions and set some boundaries. And so maybe having some guidelines, like we're going to put our cell phones in a pouch, we're going to do those kinds of things, might be best in some circumstances for some teachers and for some kids.
Okay, so respond to this question.
Sure.
I think you would agree with this proposition that if somebody violates some code of conduct and the discipline that they receive is certain, they'd be less likely to violate it if sometimes they get caught and sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's enforced and sometimes it isn't. Would you agree with that as a general proposition?
That's a hard one for me to say I agree with.
Okay.
Again, I'm going to point back to, so I mean, I'm not saying no to that, but I'm also not saying yes. I think what I would point us back to is the literature, and I would reference the literature on the school to prison pipeline. So our prison system in America is filled with people who were suspended as kids. It's filled with them. And so if suspending children, if having these long consequences changed behavior, then I would say go for it. But what we know is that it doesn't necessarily result in a change of behavior. I think about it this way. There's a lot of things that I can do as a mom. I'll just kind of speak as a mom for a second. There's a lot of things that I can do as a mom that can stop my kids' behavior, right? I can raise my voice. I could choose to spank my children if I want to. I could take something away from them. I can get angry enough and scary enough to stop their behavior. But it's entirely something different to change their behavior. And so I have to ask myself a question as a mom, as an educator, as a mental health professional. Is my goal here to stop behavior or change behavior? I'm going to argue that we want to change behavior. And so if that's the case, when we look at history, we look at the literature, we know just suspending children isn't keeping our prisons empty. It's not. They're filled with people who were suspended as kids. We have to start asking ourselves the question, what are we going to do to change behavior? Now, I'm not suggesting that we don't have consequences. So don't hear me say that. I'm not saying that there shouldn't be consequences for behavior. There absolutely should be consequences for behavior. But I think we really need to look at that from like a best practice perspective, from a whole student, whole school, whole child approach, and try to figure out what can we do? What kind of consequences can we have? What kind of restitution can be in place to really focus on changing behavior? What can I do? I know this is going to sound easier, than maybe it is. But if I'm a school teacher, I'm probably asking myself, what kind of teacher do I want to be that my kids are engaged and focused on me and not on their phones? And then I would put some of those things into practice. And
it's a hard thing,
It is.
The tablets are great babysitters. A lot of these kids are coming from families with one parent.
Absolutely.
And he or she is overwhelmed trying to do everything.
Absolutely. Yeah. And two-parent family homes even. I mean, we go back to that whole conversation about addiction. There's little kids who are addicted to their tablets and addicted to cell phones. And what we know through research is that too much screen time, no matter how old you are, negatively impacts your mood. Doesn't make sense to me. Like, why would staring at my phone 4 hours a day make me in a bad mood? I don't know, but what I know is it does.
Yeah.
And so limiting screen time would be my first suggestion. Like get away from, not get away, but the idea of banning cell phones or not banning cell phones or whatever. My first goal would be, what can I do to limit their screen time, to improve the mood and the behavior, and then go from there?
I meant to ask this a little earlier. As an expert in the field, one of the sayings that people say is correlation is not causation.
Sure.
And to what extent do you think there really is a link between mental health issues with teens and cell phone usage?
I mean, I think there's no doubt that they're correlated. There's absolutely no doubt. Our state, the state of Missouri, the Department of Mental Health does a Missouri student survey every 2 years. We ask a lot of questions to secondary students. We get some really great data out of that. And we see in there that a large percentage of students admit and acknowledge to saying something hurtful about a peer in a text message or through a social media online site. I think all of those things are then going to contribute to kids feeling anxious, kids feeling depressed. There's some research on how often a kid might check their cell phone at night, which if you're going to ask me for my recommendation on anything, it's that kids should not have cell phones in their bedrooms at night. Okay, I feel very strongly about
sleep
that.
Deprivation, right?
100% for sleep deprivation. But when you look at some of the research, there's some research out there that says kids are checking their phones anywhere up to 10 times a night for no other reason
No kidding.
than reputation management. For
My
no other
gosh.
reason than that. Yeah. And so, of
My
course,
goodness.
that's going to impact their mental health. Of course, that's going to have a significant impact on their ability to function and their emotional and social health.
So how would you advise if you were asked for the school board to proceed on this subject?
Well, I'm always going to be an advocate for allowing experts to be experts. And so I think, we hire superintendents and we hire administrators for a reason. And that is because it's their area of expertise. They've got a lot of education. And I can promise you they've seen the research and the literature before anybody else has. They've spent a lot of time digging into that. So I'm always going to recommend that we let experts do their job. And so I would point to say, I would ask our people to to trust these experts in doing their job. And I think I would agree with what I've read that Dr. Lathan has said, which is we do need to have some boundaries. There are some boundaries that we need to take into some consideration. And I think I would encourage him to continue the conversation. I think it's okay to ask questions and continue the conversation and say, hey, where are we at with this? Have we done some data collection? Are we exploring and seeing where are things working well? Where are they not working well? Learn from each other. If there are administrators and teachers that have implemented a policy or procedure in their building and it's really successful, then I would encourage, let's get on board, give it a try in all the buildings. But that would probably be my recommendation.
Amy, thank you for being my guest today on In Our Town.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed
It's been fun.
Yeah, it's been fun. Thank you.
That's it for this week, and many thanks for listening. If you'd like to listen to other episodes, you can visit the Springfield Daily Citizen website at sgfcitizen.org/In Our Town, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.